Captain Rachel Hartman entered a room where judgment preceded her presence, dismissed for her youth, gender, and silence. Whispers followed her every move, each glance laced with doubt. Yet Rachel didn't waver. She endured the disrespect without flinching, letting her competence speak louder than any defense. When the colonel unexpectedly called on her to lead the briefing, the skeptics were silenced by her mastery. But everything changed when a four-star general walked in, crossed the room, and saluted her. The very symbol of authority honored her, leaving the room speechless, transformed by a single moment they'd never forget. If Rachel's story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone quietly powerful, please support our channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that reveal true courage. Let's keep lifting voices that lead not with noise, but with integrity. Fell into a hush as she entered. A few heads turned, eyebrows lifted in subtle surprise. Others kept their eyes on their coffee or their tablets, feigning indifference that only half-masked the undercurrent of doubt. Then came the voice from the back, loud enough to carry, soft enough to feign casualness. "Lose the uniform, sweetheart. You're embarrassing the real soldiers here." A ripple of muffled chuckles followed. Some boots scraped against the concrete as their owners shifted, backs turned pointedly away from her, their body language dismissive. It wasn't the words alone. It was the ease with which they were spoken, the entitlement in the tone, as if this kind of mockery was a tradition and she had simply walked into the middle of it. But Rachel didn't flinch. Not a twitch in her brow, not a flicker in her posture. She remained exactly as she had entered, back straight, feet at parade rest, hands clasped behind her. Her eyes remained steady, her expression unreadable, as though the sting of the words had passed straight through her without leaving a mark. No rebuttal, no glance toward the offender. Just silence, calm and deliberate. What they saw was a uniform worn by a woman who didn't fit their image of a real soldier. What they didn't see were the countless hours, the deployments, the nights spent planning operations in hostile environments, the quiet victories earned in briefing rooms and combat zones alike. They didn't see the scars, emotional and otherwise, that came not from being coddled, but from being relentlessly tested. And they didn't know that those words, meant to cut, had bounced off someone who had already endured much worse and kept walking. The silence stretched. Rachel remained unmoved. And then, the heavy door creaked open again. This time, the figure who entered brought the room to a full stop. A four-star general. Every head turned. Conversations died in their throats. The same officers who had just smirked or looked away snapped to attention with reflexive precision. But what came next changed everything. The general looked directly at Rachel, and then, in a gesture full of intent, he raised his hand in a sharp salute. Not a casual nod, not a polite greeting. A formal, crisp salute from the highest-ranking officer in the room, directed at the captain they had just tried to dismiss. Rachel returned the salute, her movements clean and practiced. Not a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face. No smug smile, no triumph. Just professionalism, steel-edged and composed. And in that instant, the room froze. Every whispered assumption, every silent judgment unraveled at the seams. Who was she? Why did he salute her? The questions burned behind every pair of eyes. And suddenly, the same uniform they had mocked took on a new weight, one they couldn't explain, but now couldn't ignore. That was the moment Fort Rididgemont's Joint Command Transition Program revealed itself for what it truly was. Beneath the structured lesson plans and scheduled drills, beneath the cross-service simulations and mission rehearsals, it was a crucible, a test not just of strategy or operational knowledge, but of character. Officially, it was designed to prepare military leaders for high-stakes collaboration across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. It was a 2-week grind of joint exercises, decision-making under pressure, and rewriting standard procedures to fit unpredictable environments. But in reality, it was more than training. It was exposure to ego, to bias, to the quiet prejudices that still lurked in corners of the military culture. It was a mirror that showed who cracked under scrutiny and who held firm under fire, whether that fire came from the enemy or their own peers. For decades, these programs had belonged to a certain archetype. Men with decades of combat experience, often loud, direct, and commanding. The unspoken message was clear. You belong if you've bled, if you've commanded in the field, if you match the mold. Anyone else? A novelty, at best. A threat, at worst. So when someone like Captain Rachel Hartman walked in, young, reserved female, that mold began to splinter. She was 30, but her presence didn't scream for attention. She didn't throw her weight around. She didn't seek validation. Her silence, in fact, was what unnerved them the most. Because it wasn't empty, it was filled with knowing. Her kind of leadership wasn't loud. It was sharp-edged and unshakable. And yet, in rooms like this, that kind of leadership had to prove itself in ways her counterparts never would. She had to be better, always. Sharper, more prepared, more composed. Because every mistake would be a reflection, not just on her, but on every other woman or young officer trying to break through the ranks. So she learned to let her actions speak, to show up without flinching, to deliver outcomes that couldn't be argued with. She knew that the only way to quiet the room wasn't to fight for space. It was to make herself impossible to dismiss. And when the generals saluted her, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a reckoning. It reminded them that rank isn't just worn on the chest. It's earned. And respect isn't granted by groupthink. It's demanded by performance. That morning, Rachel didn't just enter a briefing room. She entered a legacy, one that would ripple far beyond the concrete walls of Fort Rididgemont. Because change doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks in quietly, stands still under fire, and waits for the world to catch up. Just moments after she entered, the room dipped into a hush filled with muttered remarks, deliberately pitched to reach her ears. A staff sergeant leaned close to his companion, a smirk tugging at his lips. Look at that. Another PR pic. Bet she's never seen a real op in her life. A low chuckle followed, someone else's gaze sweeping across Rachel like she was part of the wallpaper. No one shifted to offer her a seat. No one addressed her. The only acknowledgement she received came wrapped in derision, tucked inside glances and tones that didn't bother hiding their disdain. The message wasn't spoken outright, but it was sharp and clear. You don't belong here, dumb. Rachel didn't let it shake her. She moved silently to the side of the room, settling into parade rest, her posture straight and her hands locked behind her back. She didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't try to explain. She knew this scenario all too well. Not this specific room, perhaps, but dozens just like it. Places where people took her quiet as weakness and her youth as inexperience. Rooms where those in uniform weighed your worth by superficial molds you either fit or didn't. I've seen this happen more than once in real-life military circles. A young female officer steps into a command post or mission briefing, and the atmosphere shifts, not with anything overt, but with subtle looks, a patronizing tone, or the assumption that she must be support staff, or worse, a diversity hire. One lieutenant I worked with during a joint exercise comes to mind. She was brilliant, spoke 2 languages fluently, had multiple combat deployments under her belt, yet for the first several days, her peers treated her like a glorified assistant. They gave her coffee orders, passed her admin tasks, never once bothered to check her credentials. It took one high-stakes coordination drill for her to dismantle every one of their assumptions. By the time they realized their mistake, she had already proven them wrong, but the sting of their bias had already landed. That morning at Fort Rididgemont, Rachel Hartman faced more than just casual disrespect. She stood under the crushing weight of assumption, old toxic ideas about what leadership should look like, how it should sound, how it should carry itself. If you didn't match the picture, you weren't ready. Worse, you were presumed to be part of some box-checking initiative. That kind of mindset doesn't just damage the individual on the receiving end, it chips away at the very integrity of leadership itself. It blinds good leaders to excellence standing right in front of them. It builds walls where unity should live. And perhaps most dangerously, it fosters a culture where silence is no longer strength, but becomes an open invitation for bias to thrive without consequence. Rachel understood all of this, And she didn't waste energy trying to persuade men who had already decided her worth before she said a single word. She let the moment stand, unchallenged, let their comments settle in the air like smoke, knowing they'd choke on them soon enough. Because what they didn't yet realize, what they couldn't yet see, was that this room would belong to her. Not because of a title, not from delivering grand speeches, but through sheer, undeniable capability, through actions that couldn't be ignored, through leadership that would force even the most skeptical to sit up and pay attention. So she stood her ground, calm, unshaken, waiting for the moment when her performance would speak in a language they couldn't dismiss. From the second Captain Rachel Hartman stepped across the threshold, the mockery began. It wasn't blunt, it was sharp in a different way, quieter, more corrosive. It came in sidelong glances that skimmed over her like she didn't exist. In the crooked smiles shared between officers who believed they'd seen enough combat to know everything worth knowing. In snide remarks cloaked just enough to dodge confrontation. Bet she's here for the diversity stats. Maybe she's planning the next charity event. Wonder if she even knows how to load a rifle. None of them said it directly to her. They didn't need to. The tone, the posture, the smug air, it all said the same thing. You don't belong here, Butchie. But Rachel didn't react. She didn't snap back, didn't protest, didn't try to defend herself. She held her posture, parade rest, composed, eyes forward. This wasn't new. She had stood in these shadows before where the burden of proof was hers alone to carry. And she wasn't about to give them what they wanted, a reaction to justify their prejudgment. The loneliness in those moments wasn't just emotional. It played out in quiet, cutting gestures. When the operations clerk stepped in to pass out briefing folders, he handed one to every seated officer, bypassing Rachel as though she wasn't even present. Not a glance, not a nod to acknowledge her rank, just an erasure so precise it could only be deliberate. When more officers trickled in late and chairs were shuffled to make room, no one gestured for her to take a seat. They watched her stand and let her stand like she hadn't earned the privilege of sitting among them. Conversations bloomed around her about deployments, missions, shared war stories. Yet no one asked her about hers, not even when someone brought up an operation she'd actually served on. Her voice was excluded, her presence ignored, as though she had nothing of value to offer. In their eyes, she didn't. Not yet. Not until she fought to prove it again and again. But Rachel Hartman wasn't new to this war, and silence didn't mean surrender. It meant patience. It meant strength held back, waiting for the right time to strike, not in anger, but with excellence. I've seen this happen more times than I can count. A young officer walks into a room, she's in uniform, she's a woman, she's a minority, and the air changes. Before she even speaks, judgments have already landed on her shoulders like weights, assumptions that she's unqualified, that she's inexperienced, that she doesn't belong. It's not unique, it's routine. I remember a lieutenant I once served with. She was sharp, no, sharper than most, but quiet. In planning sessions, her voice would get buried beneath the confident ramblings of her male peers. That was until one day she outmaneuvered them all during a live combat exercise. It wasn't just a win, it was strategy perfected in motion. And yet, even after that, the respect they gave her came with gritted teeth, like it cost them something to admit she was better than they expected. What people don't talk about enough is the quiet damage this does, the invisible erosion of confidence. It's relentless. Day after day, walking into your post knowing that no matter what you've done or how capable you are, others have already made up their minds about your worth. It's carrying the invisible weight of their doubts on top of the actual responsibilities you signed up for. While some get the benefit of the doubt simply by showing up, others have to claw for it inch by inch. And when someone like Rachel succeeds, it's never taken as a given. It's treated as an anomaly, a one-off, rather than a testament to consistent ability. But Rachel, she didn't let that break her. She met it like the most grounded professionals do, by taking charge of the things she could control. She didn't internalize the noise around her. She didn't shrink to fit their comfort levels or lash out for validation. Instead, she dug deeper into her core, her training, her discipline, that unshakable inner strength that didn't need applause to be real. And that's where her power lived. It's easy to shout for attention, to demand acknowledgement. What's harder, what Rachel mastered, is rising beyond the need for it. Every slight, every smirk, every dismissive nod only polished the edge of her resolve. That's the burden many carry. Not the job alone, but the constant, punishing requirement to prove your place in it again and again. For women, for underrepresented voices in spaces still echoing with the comfort of tradition and hierarchy, no success is permanent and no error is forgettable. Rachel wore that reality like armor. She didn't complain because she understood something essential. What so many before her have lived and breathed. The only way through is excellence over and over until the doubt has nowhere left to hide. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was endurance. It was resolve shaped into something unbreakable. Where others might crack under the ceaseless pressure, Rachel became honed. Where others might seek validation from those least willing to offer it, she turned inward and made her strength self-sustaining. She was preparing, not for acknowledgement, but for the moment that would inevitably arrive. The moment when there'd be no need to explain, no space for anyone to talk over her, because her actions would make the case better than words ever could. And when that moment came, even her loudest doubters would have no choice but to fall silent. That is the essence of quiet strength. It doesn't waver. It doesn't fade. It doesn't just survive. It wins in the most undeniable way. It began with boots, measured, deliberate footsteps echoing against the hard floor. They cut clean through the low-level murmur of offhand comments and half-hearted chuckles that had filled the room just seconds before. The moment Colonel Thomas Reynolds stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Not all the way, but enough. Officers straightened in their seats. Their previous slouch gave way to something more formal, more cautious. The easy disrespect that had floated freely was now being tucked away behind military decorum. "Gentlemen and officers," the colonel began, his eyes flicking, barely noticeably toward Rachel. His voice didn't need to be loud to dominate the space. It carried weight, clarity, command. But it wasn't what he said that would change the mood. It was what followed. Today's briefing will be led by someone with first-hand experience of the operations we're about to review. Someone who's seen the plans not as abstract diagrams or reports, but as living, breathing missions in the field. A low current of murmurs rippled through the room. Officers exchanged glances, unsure, anticipating a seasoned major perhaps, or a battle-worn special operations vet stepping in from the hallway. Eyes drifted toward the door, then the colonel turned deliberately toward the back of the room. "Captain Hartman, please take the floor." Every head snapped toward Rachel. The noise stopped. The amused expressions vanished. For a split second, disbelief hung in the air like static. But Rachel didn't flinch. She stepped forward with a calm that seemed to silence the floor beneath her. Not hurried, not tentative. Steady, certain. She reached for the dry erase marker at the easel, her face unreadable, except for the cool concentration behind her eyes. There were no notes, no slides, no handouts, just her. And when she started speaking, her voice, low but firm, cut through the room like a clean blade. No showmanship, just clarity, precision. She talked through a layered, multi-phase operation plan like she'd memorized it. No, like she owned it. She laid out escalation scenarios, contingency deployments, high-stakes extraction protocols. These weren't just terms from a manual. They were experiences. Every step she outlined wasn't theoretical. It was lived. You could feel it, and they could too. At first, the silence was shock, but soon it transformed. It became a listening silence, a learning silence, the kind of silence that demands attention because something real is unfolding. Officers who had minutes ago looked through her like she was invisible now leaned forward, eyebrows furrowed, minds recalibrating. Rachel wasn't giving a briefing. She was recounting battle-tempered knowledge, the kind that can't be Googled or faked. It was the sound of credibility earned under fire, of trust carved out in the split seconds between danger and decision. She had been there. While they read reports, she made them. While they imagined what it might be like, she knew. "I've seen this change before. the hard, forced recognition. When a room full of skeptics realizes all at once that the person they doubted is the very expert they needed. The moment hung heavy in the air. The kind of moment when a room full of doubters suddenly comes face to face with the quiet, unmistakable presence of someone who has done what they have only ever theorized about. I remember a marine logistics officer who was barely acknowledged until she effortlessly outmaneuvered an entire team during a crisis op. I still see the young Army captain whose calm, surgical dismantling of a flawed security plan left an entire room of senior staff speechless. It's a rare and potent thing when quiet, unshakable competence cuts straight through posturing and ego. That's exactly what happened with Rachel Hartman. As she began speaking, something shifted. You could see it in the posture of the room, like ripples breaking through still water. Officers who had dismissed her outright just hours earlier were now leaning forward, pens scratching hurried notes on notepads that had remained blank all morning. The staff sergeant, the one who had laughed the loudest, whose earlier joke had drawn cruel snickers, now sat with shoulders tense, eyes locked on the whiteboard as if it held the answers to questions he hadn't known he'd been asking. No one interrupted her. Not once. No sarcastic coughs, no sideways glances, no quiet chuckles in the corners. Because Rachel wasn't commanding attention with her rank or with some loud declaration. She had earned it, minute by minute, through sheer mastery of her subject. Her voice didn't need to rise. Her presence alone did the work. When she concluded the briefing, no applause followed. No one would have dared. The room was utterly silent, not because someone demanded it, but because they were too stunned, too humbled by what they had just seen. A leader stood before them, not in theory, not in aspiration, but in action. One who had carved every inch of respect she received with relentless precision and lived experience. And that moment, quiet, powerful, redefined the entire atmosphere in the room. The snide remarks that had floated so easily before were gone, and not because Rachel had silenced them with retorts or prideful speeches. She didn't need to. She had shown them what kind of leader they all hoped to become, and in doing so, made them reckon with what they weren't yet. And still, that was just the beginning of how the tone in the room would change. The silence wasn't the kind born from awkwardness. It was reverent, the kind you rarely find in a room full of high-ranking officers. After Rachel's briefing, flawless, laser-focused, and delivered with no notes, no hesitation, the very same men who had spent the morning mocking her now sat upright, unblinking, their expressions a complicated tangle of unease, disbelief, and reluctant admiration. What she had just done had unsettled them, not because she broke rules, but because she shattered the limits of their expectations. She didn't just lead a briefing. She laid bare every bias in the room, exposing them with nothing but skill and unassailable truth. Then the door opened. No dramatic entrance, no overplayed theatrics, just a firm, confident push. Clear, unwavering authority walking in without the need for announcement. A presence that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it effortlessly. General Richard Cross stepped through the doorway. The 4 silver stars glinting against his worn combat uniform were the only adornment he needed. No aide announced him. No guards flanked him. No clipboard or bustle of activity preceded him. Just a man whose reputation had long preceded his entrance, and whose presence alone that carried a weight that made everyone in that room straighten instinctively. Chairs scraped as every officer and enlisted member rose to attention, posture snapping into rigid form. Boots hit the floor with practiced precision. The half-written notes and scribbles of moments ago fluttered to the floor, forgotten. Whatever casual indifference had existed was instantly swept away by a wave of sharpened tension. Everyone in that room had snapped into form. Everyone but Rachel. She hadn't moved. She stood just as she had when the briefing began, perfect posture, full military bearing, completely composed. She didn't need to adjust a thing. Even as General Cross entered, a man who, for most in that room, was the highest-ranking officer they'd ever stood before, Rachel held steady, not in defiance, but because her presence was already fully anchored in purpose. General Cross paused just inside the room, letting his gaze travel, not passively, but with the depth and precision of someone who had long learned to read people faster than maps. He wasn't just seeing uniforms or ranks. He was taking in the entire story, each whispered judgment, every unspoken doubt, every flicker of conscience that had started to shift. He saw the colonel who had supervised but said nothing, the senior NCOs who had chuckled and rolled their eyes, the officers who had watched the mockery unfold and remained still, silent bystanders. Then his gaze settled on Rachel, and without hesitation, he walked forward, boots steady, gaze unwavering. He passed by the colonel, by every NCO who had smirked earlier, by every officer who had underestimated her. He never slowed. His steps carried more weight than any rebuke could have. He stopped in front of Captain Rachel Hartman. What happened next didn't last more than a few seconds, but it carried the weight of everything Rachel had ever endured, everything she had ever fought through to stand in that very spot. General Cross looked her directly in the eyes. Then he lifted his hand, crisp and deliberate, and rendered her a formal salute. Not a polite gesture, not a ceremonial courtesy. This was a salute born of respect, earned, not given. The kind of salute that says, I see you, I see what you've accomplished, and you have my full recognition. The room froze. No breath drawn, no rustle of paper, no foot so much as shifted. The same men who had mocked her just that morning now stood like statues, frozen in place, forced to witness something undeniable. Because that salute wasn't just for a brilliant briefing. It wasn't just for Rachel's control under pressure or her command of the mission details. It was for everything that had come before. Every mission flown through fire. Every choice made in silence. Every life saved. Every burden carried in the shadows. Every moment of leadership when no one was watching. General Cross knew it. And now, so did they. And I've seen moments like this before. Rare, raw moments when the truth of someone's worth is finally, silently, and universally acknowledged. Moments when recognition is offered not with ceremony, but with weight. There was no need for fanfare, no dramatic gestures, no ceremonial speeches. Just a single motion, a salute, that carried more weight than any words ever could. I once watched a command sergeant major stop in the middle of a crowded war zone chow hall to shake the hand of a young specialist who had stood guard alone during a brutal attack. Another time, I saw a senior officer pause to personally thank a junior medic who had spent the entire night tending to wounded civilians, never once resting. Those moments etch themselves into you. They stay buried deep, and they change how you see the world. So when General Evelyn Cross lowered his hand after saluting, he spoke just one sentence, a single line, and yet it landed like a thunderclap. Every person in that briefing room would remember it, not just for what was said, but for what was meant. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, turned, and exited with the same deliberate grace with which he had entered. No dramatic exit, no lingering pause. But his message had been unmistakably delivered. The lesson had been planted deep in the room's silence. Rachel stood motionless. She didn't scan the room for approval. She didn't shift her stance or smile or seek validation from anyone. She merely lifted her hand, returning the salute with quiet precision, and calmly stepped back to where she'd been. To her, perhaps, this wasn't some grand, defining moment. Maybe she'd always known her own worth. Maybe she didn't need anyone else to confirm it. But now they knew. No one spoke after the general left. The door closed behind him with a soft but final click, and the silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand, more piercing than any speech could have been. Not a soul dared to break it. Officers, NCOs, clerks, all of them stood frozen, each lost in a swirl of realization and regret. Just minutes earlier, many in that room had felt so sure of themselves, so certain about where everyone stood in the unspoken hierarchy, so sure of who Rachel Hartman was, or who they assumed she was. And now, that certainty had shattered. Rachel didn't linger. She didn't strut or smile. She just took her place back off to the side as the next briefing segment resumed, as though nothing unusual had just occurred. As though receiving a personal salute from a four-star general was as routine as standing in for morning roll call. But for the others, nothing felt routine anymore. Something had shifted, not in the air, but in them. It began subtly, Later that same day, as Rachel walked the halls of Fort Rididgemont, heads that had once turned away now lifted in greeting. In the mess hall, conversations no longer fell silent at her approach. They continued, but with a different tone, one laced with quiet respect. The next time she entered a meeting room, chairs were slid aside without prompting, space made without a word spoken. No formal apology was ever given, but the message was clear. We were wrong. By the next morning, it was no longer just about that salute. It was what it meant, what it stood for. Officers who had once laughed behind her back now leaned in to listen when she spoke. NCOs who dismissed her now addressed her with the respect her rank had always warranted. But the most remarkable thing? Rachel didn't change, not in the way people sometimes do when they finally get the recognition they deserve. She didn't soften to win favor. She didn't become cold or smug. She just kept doing the work, quietly, efficiently, exactly the way she always had. No celebration, no need for applause, because legacy, true legacy, especially in a place like the military, isn't born from flashy speeches or grand ceremonies. It's forged in quiet, powerful moments. Moments like the one they had all just witnessed. And that moment didn't stay locked in that briefing room. It spread, like wildfire, like whispered folklore. The story traveled across Fort Rididgemont with the speed only military rumor could manage. But it carried a different kind of weight, the kind born from a lesson learned the hard way. Officers started referencing it in hushed talks, a subtle caution to check their assumptions, to look beneath the surface before passing judgment. I've seen it happen before. Just one act of recognition, one simple gesture, can reshape an entire culture. I remember working in a unit once where a single act of courage by a quiet, often overlooked staff sergeant rewrote how we saw each other, how we valued each other. That same kind of shift happened here. General Cross's salute didn't just affirm Rachel's worth. It held up a mirror to everyone else. It forced them to ask themselves what leadership really looked like, what strength truly meant. And Rachel? She never sought that legacy. She wasn't chasing accolades or trying to prove anyone wrong. She just remained unwavering in who she was. She endured the whispers, the doubts, the subtle humiliations. And when the moment came, she delivered, calm, collected, unshaken. In doing so, she didn't just earn respect, she built a legacy, one that wove itself into the DNA of Fort Rididgemont. A legacy passed silently from one rotation to the next. A reminder that real authority doesn't come from a shiny badge or a loud voice. It comes from consistency, courage, and character. And once that kind of respect is earned, the echo of it endures, far beyond the walls where it first took root. Rachel's legacy didn't begin or end with that salute, but that moment ensured it would never be forgotten. Rachel Hartman's story will never fade from memory. It's far more than a simple military anecdote. It resonates deeply as a reflection of the human experience itself. What unfolded in that briefing room wasn't confined to one isolated place or profession. Situations like that could just as easily play out in a corporate boardroom, a high school classroom, a town council meeting, or even across a dinner table at home. The dynamics are all too familiar. Assumptions made too quickly, people judged based on age, attire, rank, or the absence of it, without pausing to understand who they really are and what they bring to the table. How often do we fall into that trap ourselves? Jumping to conclusions based on appearances or first impressions, believing we've sized someone up before they've even had a chance to speak or act. Rachel's moment reminds us that genuine strength, the kind that commands lasting respect, is grounded not in what we see at first glance, but in what people actually do. We live in a world flooded with noise, loud voices dominating headlines, dramatic gestures pulling all the attention. It's easy to forget that sometimes the strongest presence in the room is the one that doesn't clamor for the spotlight. Rachel offered a different example entirely. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insist others acknowledge her value. She simply stood firm, let the quality of her work do the talking, and allowed her quiet competence to shift the energy in that room completely. And it did. Her actions dismantled prejudice more effectively than any speech could have. That's a lesson we'd all do well to carry into our lives. Whether you're leading a team of professionals, Nurturing a family, volunteering at the local shelter, or just trying to be a good friend or a neighbor. The real measure of who we are lies in what we consistently choose to do, not in how we're initially seen. Rachel also revealed something even more powerful, what it means to remain anchored in your values despite being overlooked or ridiculed. She could have broken under the sting of dismissive laughter. She could have fought fire with fire, trying to assert herself by force or bravado, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned on what she knew, her training, her discipline, her experience, and most of all, her own quiet self-respect. She didn't need theatrics. She had integrity, and that was more than enough. In a time when we're constantly nudged to shout louder, to perform, to convince others of our worth through flash and flare, there's something profoundly brave about staying true to yourself and letting your work and actions reveal your strength. That kind of quiet confidence doesn't just shift perspectives, it moves people. It changes lives. It creates ripple effects that extend far beyond a single room or moment. And if we're being honest, many of us have lived some version of Rachel's experience. Maybe it was in a meeting where your suggestions were ignored until someone else repeated them. Maybe it was in your own home, where your quiet support went unnoticed until it became the thing that held everything together. Or maybe you watched someone you love go through it, a friend who kept showing up, a coworker who delivered without ever bragging, a partner who carried the weight in silence. Those quiet battles matter just as much as the loud ones. Rachel's story is an invitation, a reminder to honor those unsung moments of courage and resolve. It calls on us to recognize and celebrate quiet heroism, the kind that doesn't seek recognition, but deserves it all the same. Often, the strongest individuals in the room are the ones who don't feel the need to prove it. They just show up and do what's right. So here's something to think about. Have you ever been that person? Have you stood firm and silent in a moment that counted? Or have you been lucky enough to know someone who did? Someone who didn't ask for praise, but earned your admiration through steady, unshakable effort? If so, share that story. Tell us about it in the comments. Let's make space for these stories of quiet strength, because they're worth telling and they're worth hearing. Let's shine a light on the people who lead with humility and inner strength, who may not always be noticed first, but are never forgotten once you truly see them. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you remember someone, or helped you look at your own journey in a new way, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share more real stories like this one, where the quietest voices speak the loudest truths, and where everyday people remind us what real courage looks like. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for being part of a community that values what lies beneath the surface.